I want to welcome you all. My name is Larissa Cymbaluk-Chaladin. I'm the Kule Chair of Ukrainian Ethnography. And next to me on the screen is the former Kule Chair, Natalie Kononenko. I want to say hi, Natalie. It's great to have you here. We're part of the Kule Folklore Center at the University of Alberta. Those of you who don't know, we have regularly scheduled folklore luncheons that happen on average once a month during the various semesters that we have, the fall and the winter. I'd like to join you for the first of the winter 2025 folklore lunch. And with us today, our guest is Dr. Dorian Jurić. He's visiting assistant professor in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana University in Bloomington. He's also the Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Folklore Associated and is president of the Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Folklore Association. And Bloomington is actually near and dear to us here because one of our renowned Ukrainian Canadian folklorists, the late Robert Klamash, was associated with Bloomington, and we've had several of our folklore students move forward to study in Bloomington, and one in particular recently was Katya Chomitsky. She's right now working on her PhD, and it's great to have you join us. As I mentioned earlier in our chat, I love having guest lectures so that we can network beyond our immediate circles. Dorian's writings, he writes on oral, epic, supernatural legends, 19th century academic paradigms, and the political life of folklore in the contemporary and historical Western Balkans. And he's contributed to many journals you can find. We've listed them online. And one of the things that he's known for currently is his studying the vital shift that has occurred and led to the abandonment of many projects that once defined our field. As a scholar, long committed to applying contemporary approaches to stale and outdated subjects, Dr. Jurić will discuss some of his works today, dealing with the oral traditions of the Western Balkans, and highlight abandoned or moribund research topics that might be fruitfully pursued by upcoming folklorists working in Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dorian, so that you can fill in the blanks for us of what you've been working on recently.
No, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody at the Kule Folklore Institute for having me, or the Kule Center. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. This is not going to be my most theoretically groundbreaking work, but there's I've got a few projects that I'm kind of interested in right now, and this will end up like an enlistment video that I'd sure like to have other people be doing some of these things in other places. So my talk is called Dusting Off the Old Goods, Reviving Old Folkloristic Pursuits. And as I said, I thought I'd use this invitation to talk about giving a fresh sheen to some old-fashioned topics of folklore research. I want to reflect on some recent work that I and some others have been conducting to propose to the students at the Kule Center and anyone else who might be listening, some ideas for novel and underexplored topics that are by their nature eschewed today because they are seen as topics that have been fully explicated, wrapped up, and so returned to the shelf as complete. Now, I saw this term online the other day, upcycling. So maybe I'm upcycling old folkloristics. Many of you will know that online social media sites like TikTok and X are havens for younger generations who start trends by repackaging perfectly mundane behavior with a new title and then acting like they've invented it. One of my personal favorites was this couple of years ago, the reinvention of going for a walk, now branded as the silent walking trend. And I'm very aware of the fact that I might be doing that very thing myself in framing my talk this way. And I'll also likely run the risk of raising the ire of some of those who share my topic of research by saying no one does these things anymore. Of course, there are others, but I don't believe that any of them would argue with me if I said that these are relatively neglected research topics. So as a scholar of oral epics, supernatural legends, and other related lore in the Western Balkans, I have faced, since I first began my master's research, notably in an anthropology department, a consistent stream of comments to the effect of, nobody really does that anymore. Those comments have sometimes been delivered with a sense of derision, but most often with a sense of remorse or utter confusion about whom to recommend me to for answers to my diverse questions. That type of situation forces one to seek mentorship through books, but it also forces one to return to old research and think about the questions that have not yet been asked. And I'm excited about a number of research questions that I and some colleagues and peers have begun asking of older collected folklore materials, as scholars of oral traditions, as comparative folklorists, as archivists and historical ethnographers, and as those positioned to relate and make relevant the intangible culture of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and other related areas to an English-speaking North American and Western European audience. The field of folkloristics itself, as it has been practiced in North America, has had since its very beginning a strong bifurcation between ethnographic and bibliographic scholars. For every Franz Boas, Vance Randolph, Zora Neale Hurston, or Henry Glassy, there's always been a contemporary Francis J. Childs, Stith Thompson, Richard Dorson, or Alan Dundes. That latter type of scholar has largely vanished in our contemporary field after Richard Bauman and his peers brought in the performative turn and made ethnographers of the lot of us. Ethnography has taken a central position in our field, and while one can still find many so-called armchair ethnographers in European folklore departments, they are indeed a rare breed in North America. Elliot O-Ring might be one of the last people in our field to have occasionally warned about the fetishization of field work and reminded us that there are insights that can only be found in the library and the archive. When I meet graduate students from Canadian and US folklore departments, those working on foodways or vernacular religion, not to cast aspersions on those pursuits, far outnumber those working with folklore indices, ballads, proverbs, or other old staples of the discipline, even though there are so many new questions we can be asking of those materials. So to that end, I want to talk about 3 topics of research that are dear to my heart, often neglected, and ready for a renaissance. In all 3 cases, the focus is on oral traditions, but also concerns of a geographic nature arise throughout, which is another scholarly pursuit that regularly captures the attention of folklorists of my stripe. For each of these, I'll focus on some recent work of mine and my peers, before offering some hints for how these could relate to prospective projects for scholars of Ukrainian or other Eastern European and Eurasian folklore. I will add the caveat that I'm not as versed in Ukrainian folklore literature as I would like to be, and I certainly welcome anyone in the Q&A to correct my misapprehensions of any paucity and point me in the direction of publications that I'm not aware of. So the topics I want to touch on today are these: what I call survey studies, or we could also call them source books for supernatural beings. Number 2, comparative research using the folklore indices, and particularly here Stith Thompson's motif index. And number 3, epic geography. So number 1, survey studies. There are formats for the study of supernatural beings that are highly common. For example, at a macro level, we have encyclopedias of the supernatural, for which there are divers. That was it. While at the micro level, we have a number of studies that are village-based or unique to a certain district, region, or region of a country. Also, we have those numerous studies that focus on a singular motif or question in the study of a supernatural being. Despite the prevalence of linguistically based national frames in early folklore research, the study of individual supernatural beings at that level, what we could call a meso-level analysis, are actually quite rare. I refer to these as survey studies, though, as I said, the term source book would also be relevant. There was a span of time between roughly 1850 and the interwar period of the 20th century in which many scholars in Europe attempted studies of this type, or at least broader surveys of a single supernatural being that paid close attention to national and regional distinctions. However, the data presented in these texts was often highly generalized and cherry-picked to convey certain arguments or to highlight the most dramatic or intriguing facts, rather than to convey a clear and nuanced picture of traditional depiction in art, ritual, and belief. In my doctoral dissertation, which I completed in 2019, but am now in the process of converting to a monograph, I attempted what I believe is the ideal form of such a study on the Western Balkan fairy/nymph figure known as the Vila. A few other authors have more recently also conducted such studies or come close to them for other supernatural beings. And I've thrown a few up here. There's also a lot of articles that would fit in this category, though they don't have as pretty of covers. I'm going to show a lot of books today. People are going to think I'm working for the publishers, but I'm sure some of you are familiar with at least a couple of these. I envision the ideal version of a survey study as accomplishing 5 major goals. Number 1, focusing on a singular supernatural being in a logically delineated national, linguistic, or geographic area. Number 2, conveying an overview of the range of traditional genres that the being factors or factored into in that region. Number 3, synchronically mapping the distribution of motifs, tropes, and practices ascribed to the being. And number 4, diachronically tracing changes in those descriptions over time. With those data, the aim would then be to 5, draw meaningful conclusions about temporal and intranational distinctions, as well as the motifs and patterns that represent common understandings versus regional or even possibly idiosyncratic storytelling, ritual, storytelling, ritual, songs, riddles, proverbs, etc. These were my goals with my dissertation: to track the motifs aligned with the Vila's depiction in various genres throughout the Western Balkans. In her case, the assessment of a large sample size of material revealed generalized distinctions between her depictions in various lore. Her martial character in the epic songs is starkly contrasted with her domestic role in supernatural legends, while linkages to marital rights only occur in the lyric songs. A number of motifs also revealed themselves to be regionally bound, such as the Vila in Bosnia, unlike their peers elsewhere, like to surreptitiously steal women's clothing, while the Vila in Dalmatia are known to sing in a manner that sounds like bees buzzing, and a lot of other examples like that. This study also allowed me to successfully tease out regional and singer or teller-specific motifs in contrast to those that belong to the wider tradition. And learning the contours of various story traditions also brought forth several unique examples of things like subversive uses of common tropes dating back to some of the earliest collections, which give us another window to look at, through which to look at the tradition itself as something that, a lot of times scholars would talk about those things as degradations that happened later, and yet we have these very early forms of things that shouldn't be happening. There was also a purported West-East divide postulated in the 1970s, and that takes on a much more nuanced depiction through a deeper investigation of this nature. I was also able to make definitive statements about zones of encounter and the homes ascribed to the Vila, which I wrote up in an article for the journal Folklore in England. These and many other facts emerged from the detailed assemblage produced by exploring the Vila's folklore in this detailed manner. Given the rigid and systematic format of the dissertation, I'm now working to expand the data and convert the text into a more readable monograph for publication, while ensuring that the nuances of this approach are not lost in that translation. A bevy of such text would be an unbelievable boon for comparative researchers. As scholars of Western European lore, which has been, very highly explicated, continue to dig deeper back into the earliest depictions of such beings, and some of you might know the work of Alaric Hall, Jeremy Hart, or Richard Firth Green here, diachronic mapping of Eastern cognates will also become very indispensable. Meanwhile, modern computer technology is allowing scholars to get more creative with the ways they present synchronic mapping of monster lore. There are several websites that use Google Maps or other mapping programs to produce interactive maps of important historical and folkloric sites. Some of you might have also recently seen this article on mapping Polish and German supernatural beings that went viral online because it was accompanied by a high-resolution digital map that is a work of art on its own. And so there's a lot of these kind of creative ways that people are approaching these old practices. But moreover, setting such a thorough research goal as your initial aim for approaching a supernatural being means that, if documented carefully, you produce data tables and matrices that are incredibly helpful for mining answers to further more pointed research questions about those beings. My own data tables on the vila have been the jumping off point for many articles and chapters, and will continue to do that. I recently had a small summary chapter on the vila published in an edited volume, The Exeter Companion to Fairies, Nereids, Trolls, and Other Social Supernatural Beings, the book had as its goal the aim of compiling in one volume various European national traditions of hidden people for comparative purposes. I believe this feat has not really been ventured since the 19th century, when Thomas Keatley aimed for a global scope with his The Fairy Mythology, which was published in 1828, but then revised a few times through the 1850s. This year, I will have another chapter published in a work by the same editors, Simon Young and Davide Ermacora, this time on changeling traditions, and I believe that book will stand as a seminal work for the topic. The Kule Center's, I jumped ahead. The Kule Center's former chair and my colleague present with us now, Natalie Kononenko, has also submitted chapters for both projects. But we could really use larger books and more detailed articles and chapters that deal comprehensively with the Bohinja, Mavki, Upir, and other Ukrainian supernatural beings that feel like they have been done to death, but have never actually been approached with the true care required to really paint the tradition in its full breadth, at least not in the English language. Such works would also provide an opportunity to fill a glaring lacuna in the folklore scholarship, and that is to provide reliable English language translations of the Ukrainian supernatural legends about these beings, collected by scholars like Volodymyr Gnatyuk, Petro Lintur, Antin Onishchuk, and others. I taught a class on hidden people last semester here at Indiana University, fairy folk and those kind of things, in this kind of pan-European. I use this text as my textbook, but also looking at a global scale. And I was very hard-pressed to find reliable English language translations of Ukrainian supernatural legends about those beings, or the cognate figures in Ukraine. I really hope that someone will soon attempt such a translation project and will give us a wealth of Mavki lore and things like that. So number two, I want to talk about the indices and comparative research. In a recent response article in the Journal of American Folklore, Dorothy Noyes praised Brian Wagner's nuanced and erudite 2017 study of the global spread of the tar baby tail type, and bemoaned that when encountering the work, she, quote, felt an instant pang that the author was not a folklorist, end quote. While Stiff Thompson and some other early folklorists are discussed in the book, absent is any notable mention of the tail type index, which is referred to only as, quote, the classification system, unquote, used by Stiff Thompson, Aurelio Espinosa, and others. Wagner shows no knowledge of Hans-Jörg Uther's updated version of the index, nor the problems redressed with that revision. And nowhere in the book is the tail type number 175, the tar baby and the rabbit, mentioned. Of course, it won't shock any folklorist to learn that a literary scholar has ignored a folklore index. But what of the core scholars in our field? There are many currently working with the folklore indices, but the range of that work is quite limited. There are, at the basic level, there are those who use the tail type and motif index numbers in the simplest and most passive manner by citing them in their legend and folktale research when they arise. However, the number of folklorists today who eschew this simple practice are surprisingly numerous. When research engagement is more rigorous than this, the most common use today is to employ the index numbers as tracking markers in big data projects. Most will remember the popular and controversial 2016 article in Royal Society Open Science that used Indo-European language trees and biological phylogenetic analytical models to argue for the ancient heritage of many common folk tales. Some of those findings were quite contested, and the model itself, there's a lot to be said about how it was used, but it was still it was published in all sorts of newspapers. The Smith and the Devil is 6,000 years old and all of these things. One of the authors from that article, Jamshid Tehrani, has more recently taken part in a much more detailed but related project run by William Lamb at Edinburgh called Decoding Hidden Heritages in, I presume, Gaelic Traditional Narrative. This ambitious project is combining computational and qualitative methods to trace the distribution of a range of tales, motifs, formulae, and other features in Scottish and Irish folk tales, and I highly recommend you look into this work, which is producing some very fascinating and provocative findings. There was also a recent issue of Fabula, volume 64, issue 1 and 2, that was dedicated to computational folkloristics. And we also have a number of fairly recently launched websites in Georgia, Ireland, the Netherlands and Norway, Russia and Serbia that allow for some form of searching the folklore of these national traditions using the ATU numbers. The other important projects being conducted are the national motif and tale type indices that many dedicated scholars are still working away at today. And I list here a few of the better known ones and the nations to which they belong. Among folklorists, though, the in-depth historical geographic style studies like Wagner's Tar Baby are largely a forgotten art. It is extremely rare today for young scholars to do studies like Stith Thompson's historical examination of the Star Husband tale. Hans-Jörg Uther is a paragon of assiduousness, but also likely a little mad for deciding to revise the tale type index with all the work that such an endeavor surely demanded of him. A revision of the motif index is probably an even more foolish feat, though it is surprising that so many of Thompson's intellectual heirs treat his index as sacrosanct and don't ever suggest edits to it when he so readily edited Auntie Arnie's tale index. More importantly, it strikes me that at just the moment when many folklorists have abandoned the use of motif numbers in their works, we have entered a period in which those numbers could prove the most useful they've ever been. We now all have supercomputers in our pockets. A simple Google Books or Google Scholar search for a motif number brings up dozens of comparative global examples and could bring up thousands if we were still peppering our works with those numbers. I sympathize with the critiques of the indices, perhaps best tackled by Herman Rebel in 2013 in his book, When Women Held the Dragon's Tongue, as hierarchizing modernist projects aimed at putting boundaries on products of the endlessly generative human imagination. However, extant traditional folktales and legends often follow a limited number of common variations in form. That's just the fact, the nature of their genre. And it is not a futile exercise to expand the indices with the global examples that are now available to us. When we keep in mind the fact that the indices are a subjective system of categorization, when we cast away the old, usually chauvinistic sureties of historical diffusion patterns, and when we've long since stopped thinking in terms of forms and degradation, the useful comparative possibilities of the indices truly reassert themselves. Now, I mentioned earlier that I have recently finished a book chapter on South Slavic changelings for that second edited volume with Exeter University Press. My research there supported Lyudmila Vinogradova's earlier suggestion that a line running through Ukraine and Belarus divides changeling narratives among the Slavs between a cluster more common to Western Europe and another found more among the Russians, Finno-Ugric speaking groups, Tatars, and others. The editors and I also found some great Middle Eastern parallels that challenge some of our ideas about the diffusion of various common changeling motifs. And I also offer some speculation in that chapter about why changelings do not seem to have settled or been retained very well among the South Slavs. And the argument I make there has implications for the study of changelings also in Ukraine and other Slavic nations. Most importantly, though, in writing the chapter, I was struck by how threadbare the changeling section F321.1 of Thomson's motif index is. I was already digging through a wide range of changeling publications and sharing findings with the editors, so I decided to be a little more ambitious and revise the motif index's changeling section as I finished my chapter. This proved to be much more work than I had intended, but I have submitted the revised section with explanatory notes and some critical discussion to the Journal of Ethnology and Folkloristics, and hope that it will be published sometime by the end of the year or maybe the start of 2026 in tandem with the changeling volume. With the affordances of the modern internet, I suggest firstly that the use of tail type and motif numbers in all of our research is more useful than it has ever been, and that we should be using those systems. But secondly, that the task of updating the motif index might not be such an overwhelming undertaking if folklorists approached it as a broadly collaborative effort rather than as the magnum opus of a single scholar. If enough individual sections were revised by various researchers, and importantly drawing together all the data from the national indices, a team could easily combine them, weed out the redundancies, flesh out any neglected sections, and the revision would be completed in a relatively painless manner. I'm just going to have a drink of water. Oh, yeah. So, and finally, I want to talk about number 3, epic geography. So in the mid-1990s, we were treated to some cornerstone social scientific studies about the interconnection between storytelling and landscape. I would especially point out, I put the first 2 up here, Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places and Kent Ryden's Mapping the Invisible Landscape. Interest in the role that topography, geography, and place names serve in culture and storytelling have recently made an impassioned revival, and I've thrown up a few others that really take seriously how this lore maps to the lived environment of the people that tell it. And yet the vast majority of this research is aimed at genres like legend and oral history, and centers its focus on the mnemonic roles that landscape features serve in storytelling, or the sociocultural and imaginative impacts of living within what people often call storied landscapes. I don't remember who coined that term. I apologize for that. My primary research interests are centered on the genre of epic, which has always played an important role in folklore scholarship, but also became detached in some ways in the late 20th century due to the fact that many epic traditions died out, just as folklorists began to focus more heavily on living genres, and also because epic has always been the shared quarry of disciplines like classics or various comparative and national literatures. And so it kind of flits in and out of relevance to folklorists for various reasons. It also did not help that several epic scholars who were engaged in revitalizing folkloristic concerns in the field happened to die in quick succession in the new century. We lost Laurie Honko in 2002, Arthur Haddo in 2010, John Miles Foley at a very young age in 2012. Dean Miller died in 2018. And David Bynum just recently died in 2021, although he had dealt with a major illness for more than 10 years, and so had really stopped publishing anything. This produced a major lull in epic publications through the 2010s. Now, I'm happy to report that we are now experiencing a bit of a renaissance of both theoretical works on epic traditions, and I've again said I'll look like a book dealer. I'm plastering some of these up here. And also of new translations of heretofore unpublished epics, or else of epics that had only been published in small pressings or in fragmentary form. Natalka, you're going to have to forgive me. Your book kind of bridges the gap between these two, so I just had to pick a side to put it on, and I put it here. Now, my bifurcated introduction here is transparently leading toward the comment that there is an intersection of epic geography and place that represents an untapped field of interest. Considerations of the use of geography in epic is nothing new. I mentioned Arthur Haddo, who wrote numerous articles and appendices on situating German and Kyrgyz epic in geographical space. I might also mention John Brockington as a scholar who spent much time exploring how epic locations mapped to real-world sites in India. However, assessment of epic geographies and itineraries have always only been factual in nature. In this, geography shares much with the early research on epic that aimed to locate song content in historical reality. Nevertheless, very early on, that research revealed wide disparities between the characters and events of the songs and the purported historical roots. A brief moment of disappointment for the fact that epic could not always live up to its assumed role as folk history was quickly overtaken by a zeal to understand the processes by which historical events and figures are adapted to the format of the songs. South Slavic scholars pondered how the marginally important Battle of Kosovo became the turning point of Ottoman conquest in the epics, or how the fairly insignificant historical Marko Mrnjavčević could become the most celebrated and fantastic hero of South Slavic epic, Marko Kraljević, or Kralj Marko in Bulgaria. For some reason, epic geography has never experienced that same critical reconsideration. Into the 1980s, most analyses of epic geography represented a simple exercise of identifying and sometimes mapping factual sites, and then explaining away the folkloric remainder as either invented locations or archaic names that are no longer locatable. And this has become a topic of interest for me. In due time, I should have an article coming out in the journal Oral Tradition that treats this very problem with a specific historical case study. Working through the manuscripts of Bosnian Muslim epics, songs that the scholar Luka Marjanović collected in the late 19th century and edited for the Croatian publishing house Matica Hrvatska, revealed the case of a young epic singer named Ahmed Čaušević. While Čaušević used fairly detailed itineraries of travel for the heroes in his songs, he had the curious habit of consistently transposing one mountain. Known as Bakony in Hungary. You can see it up in the top there, shaded. And in the Croatian and Bosnian, it's Bakonja. And he moved it in all of his songs from its factual location here in Hungary, where most of his peer singers located it, to the Lika region of Croatia, some 362 kilometers southwest as the crow flies. And I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but his Bakonja is down here, way at the bottom, roughly. I have to kind of rough out where it seems that he's placing it based on looking at his itineraries. This error in the singing was only retained in the manuscripts because the songs were not collected by Marjanović, who very often wrote about the fact that he trained his singers to sing the songs the right way. Instead, these were collected by another untrained collector under Marjanović's auspices, but via written correspondence. They never actually met each other in person. Marjanović uninquisitively ascribed this alteration to an error on the singer's part and waxed wroth in various notes throughout the editing process about the collector's negligence in not correcting the singer for blundering. The fact that the habit was retained, however, allowed me to reconstruct as best I could the known and projected geography available to the singer, compare it to other collected examples, and thus to speculate on the roots of the ascription that convincingly appeared to trace the singer's artistic lineage to a neighboring region. So here's roughly all the mountains that Čaušević uses in his songs. He also gave a lot of data in one song for his home region around the Bihać area of northwestern Bosnia, where it shows very clearly he did not travel very far because he's got neighboring towns, and when he has his hero kind of ride a horse through them, he has him going back and forth all over the map while he thinks in the song that he's sending him in one direction. While writing this article, I also discovered that the scholar of Kyrgyz epic, Daniel Pryor, had preceded me in asking some of these questions of his epic tradition in a 1998 article that I highly recommend. And while I was forced to drive to all of my field locations. He was able to ride his epic itinerary on horseback, for which I will forever be jealous. But I emphatically support his assertion that place names and itineraries warrant nomination to a status near that of epithets and other formulae in the set of comparative tools available to epic scholars. Oh, and these are some photos I took in the region coming down out of the Lika to the Ravni Kotari area, where and this bottom one is the mountain around the area of the mountain that probably has been swapped for Bakonia by Čaušević. So there's much work to be done in considering all sorts of things about epic geography, proximate versus distant geography in epic traditions, the explication of specific regional uses of geography versus geographic renderings across the repertoires of individual singers, delineation of real versus imagined locations, generic naming practices, exploration of when geography was and was not expected to be accurate in the songs, and important investigations into how a neophyte singer learned and adopted itineraries. In short, the gap between factual and epic geography needs to be mined for the revelations it can provide about the art form itself, rather than the traditional approach of winnowing out the purported lies, fictions, and misapprehensions of the singers. Now, these are exciting research questions that could be brought to the Dumi and other Eastern European epics by young folklorists studying these art forms. My relatively scant familiarity with the Ukrainian epics suggests that they often lack in highly detailed geographic itineraries. However, there are several of them that trace movement in general forms along the Black Sea to sites like Kefe and Kozlov, which is, I think, today Yevpatoria, before moving up into the waterways around Zaporizhia. The heroes also venture as far afield as various eastern Haganats and south to Varna in Bulgaria. There's also a site in Moldova. Now, unfortunately, the songs that I have access to in translation, they don't have these kind of point-by-point movements through those itineraries. However, I think it would merit at least attempting to explore the realistic nature of these depictions of movement, particularly if there are more detailed variants of these songs in the Hrushevska corpus or elsewhere that I'm not familiar with. If in this case a single singer's itineraries are not substantially represented, it still might be useful to reconstruct the epic geographies presented across various songs from the same town or region. There are also useful questions that can still be posed to vaguer geographies. For instance, Kononenko mentions a song in which Khmelnytsky drives Jewish leaseholders out of the city of Polone or Polone, I'm not sure where you put the stress. In this case, the singer positions Polone on the Vistula River rather than its proper site on the Homora. One might wonder if any significance lies behind this anatopism. One also imagines that there are useful insights to be gained from reconstructing the uses of waterways, fields, and cities in the songs to understand how the singers imagine the movements of the heroes in bygone days. One could also explore the implications of real versus imagined geography in the art form, and other questions. A researcher approaching these problems will invariably find that many specific instances of these questions have been approached in older scholarship, but never all of them, never in a comprehensive manner, and always producing findings that reveal how uninterested the scholar was in understanding the logic of the tradition from an emic position. So in closing, I've discussed 3 topics of research that are personal interests of mine, but which I believe hold many opportunities for young folklorists of Ukraine and elsewhere coming up in the field. All are concerned with largely historical oral traditions and involve some aspects of geography and mapping. All are also linked by their common depiction as tired old topics that no one does anymore, but for that very reason, offer useful opportunities for re-examination. As someone who works in a region that was not so long ago ravaged by war, I understand that there are more pressing social and cultural considerations that the majority of young scholars of Ukrainian folklore will be interested in right now. That said, there will also be those who will be unable to conduct certain planned projects of field work given the Russian invasion and may need to pivot to work in the archive or library. And there will also be those who are simply not of the disposition for venturing into the field, an Alan Dundee's rather than a Henry Glassy. I hope that some of these propositions will be of interest to such scholars, because there are many comparativists like myself who would love to have access to these kind of findings from other regions. Hopefully someone listening will be inspired by one of these suggestions, take one of these old folkloristic topics off the shelf and dust off the old goods. Thank you very much.